Chapter 45. From my last attempt at rehab, post-hospital in the spring of 1994, I was to continue using drugs for another 7 years until in February 2001 I crawled my way, absolutely beaten, back into the rooms of the Narcotics Anonymous Fellowship. No matter what I thought about the spiritual premise of the 12-step program, after all these years of drug use and bipolar madness, it was the only place left for me to go. There was nowhere else. I wanted to get clean. I had to get clean if I was going to survive, but more importantly this time I had to stay clean. That was something I'd never been able to achieve, not through counselling, not through religion, not through psychiatry, and certainly not through any effort of my own. The fellowship was the only place I had ever set foot where I met people like me who had been clean for any length of time, and what's more, they seemed genuinely happy about it. I refer to the year I got clean as 2001, my space odyssey. These are my recollections of how I finally ended up back on my knees at what was to be my last rock bottom almost 9 years ago. A couple of months before Christmas 2000, my stepfather was diagnosed with cancer. He was a fit, healthy, adventurous man in his early 60s. The cancer had metastasised into his spine and the prognosis was grim. Both our families were devastated by the news. This was not part of the plan. He and my mother had recently returned from travels in Africa and the UK and had just moved into a new house. At the time I was coming to the end of my nursing studies, I'd been out on my final placement and now had state final exams to prepare for before graduation. After the exams were over and school was out, naturally my focus turned to celebrating. I didn't really have a clue what I was going to do next, but right then it didn't seem to matter. We all knew our hands would be full in the coming months with my stepfather's illness. Oh dear, selfless acts would be required of me, not my strong point. Christmas felt morbid. Our family spent the day together and made it as pleasant as we could. On the way home that evening, my friend and I called into a party we'd been invited to by some of my dope-smoking mates. As usual, they were sitting around listening to trippy music, lights low, the obligatory incense burning, nobody saying much as they were all deeply wasted by now. Someone handed me the bong and wished me a Merry Christmas, and I inhaled deeply. But it wasn't dope. It was opium. I'd never tried opiates, and my initial surprise folded as the first waves of ethereal calm settled over me. I was in trouble. I knew what I was like, and I knew that I would have to get that feeling again. Not more drug madness, please, but I knew I would if I could. Then it was New Year's, and I had agreed to help my brother with his tourism venture on New Year's Day, so the family had decided to make a weekend of it. Him and I got well plastered in the local pub on New Year's Eve, and at some point late in the evening I decided to get in the car and drive the few hundred metres back to the motel. Up the road I pulled over because it seemed logical to follow all that drinking with a puff on my dope pipe. Things started to spin. I was by now completely intoxicated and somehow managed to get the car back to the motel by driving very, very slowly. Fortunately for everyone else on the road, there wasn't anyone else on the road. Inside the motel, I suddenly remembered that I hadn't taken my medication because we'd been out all evening. So I got out my bag and, eyes crossed, counted out some lithium and some clonazepam and swallowed them down. And the next thing, bang, the drugs hit my system and collided with all that alcohol and the dope, and oh my God, I think I might be going to die. The room starts to spin really fast. The 70s brown and beige motel wallpaper is doing somersaults, leaping off the wall and back again, around and around, faster and faster. I couldn't lie down, I couldn't stand up, I couldn't tolerate the bed moving, I couldn't stay still on the floor. I was in a right state. I'd never been that ill from my poisons in all my life, and that was really saying something. When sleep finally came at around 7 in the morning, it was the greatest relief. The whole of the next morning passed me by. I was a no-show at my brother's work. He finally came looking for me about lunchtime, woke me up and shuffled me into the car. That was an awful day. I was seriously hungover and of absolutely no use to anyone. Welcome to the new year. That night turned out to be my last big drink. I'd really scared myself this time. The insane decisions, especially the driving, the intensity of the sickness, all of it, even to my selective morality, seemed really screwed up, and I never ever wanted to poison my body like that again. That was as close to hell as I was prepared to get. My addiction was progressing and I knew it. Since the opium at Christmas, I'd once again given myself completely to my disease. Something had to give. And sure enough, that something came. It didn't take long. Things finally reached boiling point a month later. My step-family were over from the UK and our families were to go camping together. I was determined to show everyone that I could be mature and responsible. I could last a week without getting trashed, and besides, my body needed a rest. So before we left home, I smoked the last of my dope, kissed my tin goodbye, and started out on my drug-free holiday with the family. The trouble with addicts is that we're at our worst when our drugs run out. Being stoned was one of my incarnations, but not being stoned was entirely another. We arrived at the campground, and that last smoke was starting to wear off. I was coming down. Putting up the tent wound me right up. Which bloody pole went with which? How was I supposed to know? I couldn't think straight, and I wasn't big on patience. And then someone dared to suggest another way of doing it, and I was so annoyed that I hurled the iron mallet I'd been holding amongst the group of bystanders who'd been watching my tantrum brew. Well, that was it. Some people's limit for my behaviour had been reached. My sister dragged me down to the beach for a walk and let me have it. What the hell was I thinking? She demanded. Didn't I realise that our stepfather was dying and this would be his last holiday with Mum and with his kids? Didn't I realise that people had far more important stuff going on than to give a shit whether I had or hadn't brought my tin with me? I had to stop this, she implored. Everyone had had enough. Nobody wanted to bail me out anymore. It was over. Sort myself out or forget about any more sympathy from the family. She told me I had to start going back to the 12-step meetings. I had to clean up. It was long overdue. I knew she was right, and in some way it felt like a relief. I didn't have to live like this anymore. There was still a choice. And then the next day arrived. I had been genuinely sincere and remorseful the day before. I had really meant it that I was going to break off my love-hate relationship with cannabis for once and for all. I was going to go straight. But then we ran into some drug friends of mine who were staying at another bay. One of them automatically brought out his goodie box and rolled a joint and passed it to me, just like we usually did. And time stood still, and everyone looked at me. What would I do? I did, of course, what every using addict would do. I took the joint and had a few puffs. Damn, I really hadn't wanted to do that, especially not in front of everyone. But no matter how badly I wanted and needed to leave it alone, I could not say no. Like it says in step 1, I was completely powerless over my addiction and my life had become unmanageable. It had me. I hated being stoned that afternoon. I couldn't wait for it to pass. My head hurt. I felt paranoid and guilty in front of my family and bewildered at the intensity of my weakness when I had been so sure I would not pick up. And that was it. Stopped right there. Something happened. I just suddenly, from somewhere deep within, gave up the fight. I surrendered. I finally knew I had to stop or go crazy or die. There was nothing else left down that worn old path, and I knew that I could not do it alone. This monster was bigger than me, and I had to go back to the only people who could really help me, the people I knew from recovery, the ones who had been there too. From that day onward, I never smoked another joint, lit another pipe, or touched another alcoholic drink. It was February the 3rd, 2001. My stepfather passed away in July of that year. I was 6 months clean.